We are going to continue on in our study of John. I know we've got several folks visiting with family for Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all of you. The reality about Mother's Day is you're either a mother or you had one. And so it's a special day, and I hope that you will, regardless of how you interact with that day, that you will find something encouraging and that somebody will encourage you. We're going to continue on in our study of John. We're going to be in John chapter 18. So we are nearing the end, and there's so much in John. We have really undertaken just a flyover of John. I was telling Mike earlier this week, this has been good for me because this is not normally what I do. Normally, if I had taught John the way that I normally taught John, we would be studying John for like 7 years. Which isn't always a good thing. So being able to kind of see, high-level things, I think is good much of the time. And so it's been a good opportunity for me to kind of think in a way that I don't normally think. Some weeks, as you probably can imagine, are pretty challenging because John's pretty full of things, a whole lot going on in this gospel. So what I thought we would do today is really just kind of focus in on one section. Rather than trying to overview the whole thing, I really just kind of want to focus in on one section of John, the 18th chapter, and that's specifically the section where Pilate comes to the surface. So I've got a lot I want to say about him in a minute, and I've got some questions that I want us to talk about. Before we do that, let's pray and ask for God's help as we read His Word and study His Word. Let's do that now. God, we're thankful. We're thankful for every opportunity that we have. We're so thankful for Your Word, and God, we know we can't tell You thank You enough. Father, I pray that thanksgiving would be genuine and earnest in our hearts. We need You. We need Your power. God, we need Your Word to guide us and help us as we want to live for You. We want to live with You. We want to live in You and through You. There are times where that's hard, and times where our circumstances in this present time influence that to levels that we wished didn't occur. We confess that to You, and we pray that despite all that You would cut through and that You'd preach Your Word to us this morning, that it would be Your voice that we hear, and really no one else's. We give You thanks for John 18. We give You thanks for the people who interacted with Jesus, both those that encouraged Him and helped Him and those that didn't, because both are instructive to us. Most of all, we give You thanks for Christ. And I pray that we would see Him more clearly today than we have in the past. We pray all this in His name. Amen. So we are in the thick of what scholars or theologians call the Passion of Christ. If you heard that phrase before, it's really that moment, those moments, plural, where Jesus is about to be killed. Murdered is the right way to say it, I think. Crucified. And everything that leads up to that in that period of time is called the Passion because it was a passionate time. Some of that was good, some of that wasn't. And so it's a good period to kind of isolate and pull out and study. And we are in the thick of it, the Passion of Jesus. And so in John chapter 18, we read about Jesus beginning to interact with the legal authorities, civic authorities, the governmental authorities. We've got some in our church, and I give God thanks for them. I think even they would agree and would attest that the average person coming in contact with a governmental official is quite intimidating in any period of time. Certainly in historical time, it would have been terrifying. You know why? Because they'd kill you. And in places in the world today, that still happens. It doesn't happen as much as in the past, but it still does happen. And but there are places where it does. In history, it happened everywhere. And so really for whatever reason an official decided, they could take your life. So people didn't generally want to interact with these folks. There were a lot of political realities. Of all the people, just out of curiosity, I think maybe it's a good way to start, of all the people that Jesus interacts with during this period that we call the Passion, who intrigues you the most? Is there anybody that kind of intrigues you or that sticks out? There's no wrong answer, just out of curiosity. Who sticks out to you, the characters that interact with Jesus in this period of time at the end of his life? Come on in. Pilate, okay. Let's stick a pin in him because he's who intrigues me too. Who else? Is anybody? Peter? Yeah. There's a lot going on in Peter in there. Up and down. A lot of failure. We could talk about that for several weeks in John chapter 18, but anybody else? Pilate has always stuck out to me. I can't give you all the reasons why, but he has. He is intriguing because he's clouded in a little bit of mystery. The Gospels treat him very kindly as kindly as a non-believer can be treated, and as kindly as the person who handed Jesus over to be killed. I should say it this way, the Gospels treat Pilate more generously than history does. History treats Pilate pretty negatively, and that's probably pretty fair. But the Gospels treat him a little more generously than history does. There are a couple of realities about Pilate that I think are worth noting. And so some of this maybe you've heard, some of it maybe you haven't. I think it will set up a couple of questions that I want us to discuss together. So my intent is maybe to talk for the next couple of minutes, and then let's talk together and discuss some things. Who's the power in the world during the time of Jesus? Who's the government of governments in the world? Do you know? Rome. Rome is the government of governments. Rome is the pinnacle of power in the world. So we're talking years and years and years ago. The problem for Rome wasn't gaining land. The problem for Rome wasn't increasing their power. The problem for Rome was, how do you maintain that? You go out and win a war, and honestly, that's easier to gather land than it is to keep it. Does that make sense? So, you're talking about a pretty large area in the world, a pretty sizable chunk of land, even in modern times, that Rome has to govern. They governed in a couple of ways. One was the size and scope of the Roman army. That was the primary way. They put outposts everywhere. If we put it in our perspective, like in Putnam County, we would have had dozens of outposts that would have been full of Roman soldiers. Some from Rome itself, or from Italy itself, but others, or that region itself, others from all over the empire. And so that was one way that they governed. They put soldiers everywhere. Every Roman citizen that wasn't from Rome proper, if you were a male, you had to serve in the army at one point or another. The other way that they managed to hold on to that power for such a long period of time was if you broke the law, you were punished swiftly and you were punished harshly. So you didn't mess with Rome. You didn't mess with a Roman citizen. It was well known. If you broke the law, you would be handled accordingly. The other way that they held on to as much power as they did, and what is specific to John chapter 18, they were master politicians. And so the hierarchy in Rome kind of went like this. There was a governor from Rome itself, that oversaw certain jurisdictions. That's Pilate. But they also chose a local resident to kind of partner with their governor. That's Herod. So you're familiar with those two names. Herod is a Jew, kind of. I probably should say he's a Hebrew or an Israelite, kind of. And so he's the local representative. He would deal with things first if they rose to that level, but he always had to defer to Pilate. Here's what you need to know about Pilate. Pilate hated the Jews. Hated them. The reason that history records such negative things about Pilate is because Pilate did such negative things. So I'm talking about things like this. Pilate would come in on feast days, Jewish feast days, say the Feast of Tabernacles or Passover, any of the feasts. He would come into the temple, the Jewish temple, and he would sacrifice a pig in the middle of the temple. So you can imagine how Jews felt about Pilate. Probably not real chipper relationship. There really is no modern day equivalent for us. The closest that we could get outside of some kind of sacrificial system is if somebody, interrupted an assembly and, cursed and all that kind of stuff. Oh, you're good, no trouble. Sure. That's how they felt about Pilate, the way we would feel about somebody who did that. It was an awful relationship, but there was a political reality that had to take place. Pilate had to get along with the Jews to a certain extent. Here's the tension that exists in the ancient world when it comes to Pilate. Pilate has to govern these people, has to prove to Caesar that he can govern these people, and the Jews, while being under Pilate's thumb, they can go so far to kind of push back against Pilate, but they know if Pilate snaps his fingers, Roman soldiers can come in and wipe them all out. But Pilate also knows that if the Jews begin a revolt, he's going to have to answer for that one layer up. So there's a lot of tension that's going on politically behind the scenes. He's an intriguing character. We don't know a lot about his background or his upbringing, but what we know is he ain't the greatest guy. But there's something that happens between him and Jesus. Let's read a little bit together. Those layers, I hope, are helpful. John 18, pick it up with me in the 28th verse. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas is up in the upper levels of religious leadership, to the governor's headquarters. The governor's headquarters would be Herod or Pilate, depending on where they are and how they're connected, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Verse 29. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." You see that non-answer? It's a non-answer. What has he done? Well, if he wasn't doing evil, we wouldn't be here. They don't answer the question. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." But that's what they're seeking. That's what they want. Verse 32, this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Now, this is not the primary point for today, but one of the really sad realities about John chapter 18 is that what comes to the surface is the totally unjust and illegal trial of Jesus. Every bit of it was illegal, all of it. There was, according to law, Jewish and Roman law, there were to be no proceedings at nighttime. So you couldn't grab somebody up and take them anywhere at night. The law was what it was so that people would sleep it off. Create some space or time between the so-called offense and some kind of judgment. There were no accusations that were supposed to be brought before a council unless there were more than 2 witnesses. There were no witnesses to Jesus. And they're seeking the death penalty, which is against the Jewish law for this reason. It's against the Jewish law. They want $20 worth of punishment for a $2 crime. So even according to their own accusations, Jesus breaks the Jewish law, but not the legal law. Jesus breaks the religious law and the religious tradition, but not the law legally, governmentally. So all that's to say that this trial is illegal. Do you think there's a takeaway from that for us as we start to digest this story and place ourselves in this story? Do you think there's a takeaway from that fact that the trial of Jesus was totally illegal and unjust? And he goes along with it. I think that in and of itself offers a tremendous insight into what's going on in Jesus' mind and what his purpose is, which is going to speak to the conversation and discussion he has with Pilate in a minute. What might the takeaway be from the trial of Jesus? The unjust and illegal trial of Jesus Christ.
I think it does not absolve us from obeying the laws of our land.
Sure.
Even though we know there is corruption galore.
Certainly. Sure.
The same as there was during the Roman times. But Jesus said when the coin was presented to him, do unto Caesar what is due Caesar.
Right. Right.
And we know that those laws are for our benefit.
Mm-hmm. So there might be an example there of going through that process. It is interesting to me the difference between Jesus and Paul. So Paul, when he goes before the governor, when he goes before the maybe you'll remember this from the epistles and from the book of Acts, when he goes before the governor, he doesn't, he takes the law to its fullest extent and continues to appeal higher and higher and higher, even though he didn't have to. Jesus just says, this is the way it's going to be. So there is a little bit of a difference there. I don't know that it's worth a lot, but there is a little bit of a difference there. I think it's worth mentioning. He came to die. Yeah, I think that's basically it. I think what Pam said is exactly is right on the money. Jesus endured an illegal trial, an unjust system, so that we didn't have to. It adds context and layers on the passion. Everything that he endured was for you and me. Everything. We stand before a righteous judge. We stand before a just system. And Jesus delivers us from that because he stood up to an unjust system and to an unrighteous judge. I think there's some meaning there. In verse 31, we already see Pilate not really wanting to get involved. There's a reason. Some of that is the political reality that he finds himself in, that he put himself in. It's a no-win situation for Pilate. He's got to make Rome happy. I should have mentioned before, Pilate has done so much with the Jews that Caesar has already put him on notice. If you don't keep this under control, we'll find somebody who will. What does that mean for Pilate? If somebody comes to an ancient ruler and says, if you can't do it, we'll find somebody who will, that person's life's going to end. So Pilate has already been threatened by Caesar himself, so he's got to keep Rome happy, but he's also got to keep the Jews happy, because if the Jews keep appealing and keep rioting, and if they keep fighting him, then eventually word will get back to Caesar. He also has to keep Caesar happy in the sense that he can't let criminals go free, because we've got to punish people so that the law, the Roman law, is not broken. Let's read a couple more verses, and then that'll be all we read together, and then I've got some questions that I want us to talk about. 33rd verse, John 18. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew?" Of course he's not. "Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born. For this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, What is truth?" It's one of the best questions recorded in the Bible. What's true? After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. That's as far as we'll go. That's as much as we can read this morning and even remotely discuss a little bit. This is, in this second section that we read, Pilate not knowing, now knowing that he has to be involved because the Jews are going to push the issue, begins to interact with Jesus. And it's a really interesting interaction. Pilate is sarcastic, but I think that there is, at least the way I hear this or read this, I think there's some earnestness later in the conversation. He asked Jesus, "Why are you here? Like, why are you here?" Most people are never in front of Pilate because most people don't want to be in front of somebody like that. Jesus, rather than answering his questions, he does what Jesus typically does. He asks questions. I love that about Jesus. I wish I had that skill. Jesus had it. Jesus never asked for release. He never asserted his innocence passionately, even though he was. Even though he was innocent. Jesus tells Pilate that he's a king of a kingdom not of this world. Why do you think Jesus interacts with him this way? Why doesn't he throw up his hands and say, "Hey, what they're saying ain't true. I'm innocent. This is who I am. This is where I'm from"? Why do you think he interacts with him this way? Yeah.
There's several messages that he gives. It doesn't get him sucked into the Jewish manipulation. Pilate's a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And he's letting Pilate two things simultaneously. I'm not trying to usurp your authority.
Sure.
For these people, I'm from another kingdom. And Pilate's got to be thinking, okay, this guy is either crazy or I need to pay attention.
Sure. Yes.
And I think Jesus knows and Pilate knows that he's not going to address that there, but it plants a seed for him to think about there.
It really does. And I like how you said that. I think that you're right. I think the fact that Jesus didn't assert his innocence is what catches Pilate off guard. You know, we have these natural impulses that are common to us. You know, if somebody punches you in the nose, you're going to assert their guilt, right? Nobody is a moral relativist if somebody punches them in the nose, because there's truth. That person hit me. I'm innocent of that. And so it's a natural impulse to want to assert our own innocence in somebody else's guilt. But Jesus doesn't give in to those natural impulses because he's thinking up a layer. That's not to suggest that sometimes those natural impulses are wrong, but it is to suggest sometimes those natural impulses are wrong. Sometimes they are. Sometimes what comes easy to us isn't what we should do. And I mean that in a host of ways. Jesus has mastered the art of not giving in. When I think about Jesus, sometimes I think about, if you see the video, and maybe you saw it, right after it happened. You remember when Reagan, when the attempted assassination happened of Ronald Reagan? What's interesting about that is you have this Secret Service agent who jumps in front of him. Now, that's what they're supposed to do, but how unnatural is that? When you hear gunfire, what are you going to do naturally? You're going to hit the ground. That's a natural impulse. But this guy overcame that natural impulse to do what he was called to do. How did he do that? It was years of training, indoctrination in a good sense. It was practice. It was responsibility. He accepted the high call that was placed on him, and in the moment when the gunshot rang out, he's the one guy in the room, including over all the other Secret Service agents who hit the ground, who jumped in front and took a bullet. Took a bullet for him. And it's recorded. You can watch it on YouTube. And I think about that event when I think about Jesus, or I think about the call that God has placed on our life, because you and I are called to do the same thing, to do the unnatural, much of the time to work against our natural impulses. So yeah, I think that's totally, Chad, I think that's totally going on. What else? Why do you think he interacts with Pilate this way?
Jesus knew the big picture.
Yeah.
He knew that there was a plan. And if he didn't follow through that plan, then we would all be lost.
That's right.
So I think that was
Yes.
behind some of
Yes. He knows the big picture. Ms. Jenny?
Kind of along those same lines, I think that and I always thought of the passion that he had. Always had the underlying motivation to do what was possible.
Sure. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's right. I like how you said it. In the midst of his passion, he still lived for his passion, right? We're in a period of passion, but he doesn't allow himself to kind of get off the rails. One of the really important points to remember about Jesus at this moment is that Jesus is 100% us. He's 100% man. He could have. That's why he prayed before. He could have. He could have. Jesus is 100% man. That's so important because he can keep in mind this big picture. He can keep in mind the purpose that God gave him. And here's the deal. Is it tough for you and me? Absolutely. But is it possible? It is. And that's the call for you and for me, to live like that. Jesus is God. He is deity. So we have to understand that and reckon that and relate to that truth. But we also have to see that what Jesus did in this was make a path for us. So as much as anything, maybe on a higher level than the specific events of John 18, I think Jesus is fighting against the natural urges that you and I have. And is saying to the Father, living out for the Father, your will be done, not my own. And that's the call that we have. Yeah.
I think of the example of Paul. There are others. Paul went through how many persecutions, being brought close to death. He had gotten that idea of the big picture from Christ. And therefore, he, as a human, was able to rise above it.
Yes, that's right. With that image, with that motivation, with that call, and with that obedience.
Yes.
I think so. I think so. That's well said, David.
We can be thankful that he didn't stoop to their level.
Yes,
Because he was the Son of God.
that's right.
And he had credentials higher than anybody.
That's right. And he could have and gotten himself out of this, or he could have just destroyed them all. We sing that song, he could have called angels down from heaven, and just wiped them out. But he didn't. And the song is right. He did it for you and he did it for me. I want you to laser in on that 37th verse. What is the purpose? Why did Jesus come? What does he say? For this purpose. What is the purpose? Okay, to die for our sins. There is no doubt about it.
He fulfilled the prediction.
Okay, fulfill the prediction. To stand unjustly before man. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. And all those things are true. So that is why he came. But he says in verse 37, the reason I came into the world was to bear witness to the truth. And then Pilate gives that retort in the form of a question. What is true? It's an amazing image that you've got this politician who's stuck. He's stuck between the reality that he's made for himself and fear. He's caught. And he interacts with Jesus, and he's cynical, and he's sarcastic. Why are you here? Jesus doesn't answer his question. He keeps asking questions. You are a king. Jesus, let me tell you what, I'm a king, but I'm not a king in this world. I'm from another place. My kingdom isn't here totally. For this reason I've come, to bear witness to truth. And then you have Pilate ask that question, what's truth? I tend to believe that question, what is truth, is less what's truth and more what's true. I tend, and there's no way to prove this, just the way I read it, I tend, up until this point, I feel like Pilate has been very cynical and very sarcastic, but I think at this point, something changes for Pilate. I'm not saying he comes to faith, he doesn't. But there's some earnestness in that question, what's faith? And the reason I think that is because of what happens in chapter 19, or right after this in chapter 18, in the end of chapter 19 that Mike will talk about next week. He offers to let Jesus off the hook. He tries to get Christ out of this by putting him shoulder to shoulder with Barabbas, who is an insurrectionist. He's the worst of the worst, according to the religious leaders, because he's trying to overthrow faith. He's actually guilty, based on evidence, he's actually guilty of what they've accused Jesus of. So Pilate puts him next to Barabbas and says, which one you want? And he thinks they're going to say Jesus. And then in chapter 19, he scourges him. He flogs him, which is terrible in and of itself. Just that, John 19, I think the first 3 verses. And then he comes back, tries to let him off the hook again. But he's caught. He's stuck. Now, I think he's earnest. Now, if you'll go with me there, even if you don't see it that way, if you will, just for the sake of our discussion, what insight could be gained if in that moment Pilate turns somewhat earnest? Something right in front of him.
Probably never seen Jesus stirred up.
Yes. Yes.
Maybe wonder, what is this?
Yes. Something's going on here.
He didn't like Jews, and here's a Jew that the Jews don't like.
That's right. That's real practical. Yeah.
That's intriguing.
Yes. Yes.
Jesus'
Yes.
And I think Pilate knows he's not talking about Caesar.
Yes.
Because Jesus is talking about a kingdom. And really, again, either Jesus is crazy or Pilate has got to pay attention because there's another reality about this world.
Yes. Yes. We've just got, did you have something?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's the lack of fear that Jesus is
Yeah.
showing. And, you've probably seen countless people come before him and beg for their life, and here's someone who's
Yes.
afraid, and then he suddenly becomes fearful.
Yes.
The bully who finally faces.
That's right. Yes. Yes. This response of Jesus is masterful. And it's not I don't mean that in a manipulative way. I don't think Jesus is playing a game. I think this is the life that Jesus lives because this is the faith and the knowledge and the obedience that Jesus has. The bell's going to ring any minute. And probably if you've been around long enough, have heard me use or point to this quote by C.S. Lewis. It's held up for 100 years because there's power in it, I think, in the visual. Lewis says Jesus is one of three things. He's a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's the Lord. And when you see Jesus, you've got to decide what you believe. And Pilate has got to decide. He probably thinks at times he's a lunatic. He probably thought he was a liar at the beginning. He never gets to the Lord. He never does, at least that we know of, and I don't think he does. History records that he doesn't. What is amazing about that quote, and I thought a lot about faith this week. We're talking about faith in a minute. Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah. What's amazing is from different vantage points, if you see through a certain lens, you're going to see Jesus and you're going to say he's a liar. And there are people who do. And there's others who look through a certain lens and they say, no, he's a lunatic. And I'm not saying that you have to put a lens on to see Jesus as the Lord. Really, I'm saying you got to see you have no lens, just what it is. He's one of those. And the way that he interacts with Pilate is such that because he doesn't go with natural impulses, he doesn't base things on his humanity, he doesn't base things on his own well-being. He's following out and living out the reality of his Father in heaven. He points to higher places. He's living on a higher plane. Something about that is intriguing to Pilate. Pilate's response is up to Pilate. It's not your job to make Pilate respond. Jesus didn't even do that. But what your job is and what my job is to live in such a way where we fight against those natural impulses, our humanity. We fight against it. We war against it. And we do things that are supernatural. We jump in front of the bullet when we hear the gunshot. And I'm saying there's something about that visual that draws people to truth. Now, it's up to them. It's up to them to make the decision, but there's something about that draws them. Now, I'm talking about forgiveness. I'm talking about mercy. I'm talking about, this supernatural ability to help people and love people and work with people, encourage people. Those kinds of things. When nobody else will do what you're doing, then you're probably on the right track. Yeah. It's a huge one. And so when people look at you and say, I don't know why you do that. I would never do that. And it makes sense what they're saying, you're probably on the right track. How do you still interact with that person? How do you still do this? How do you still go the extra mile? Why do you give your time to these things? That's not right on John 18, but it's up a layer because it's fighting against those natural impulses. So take stock in the call that God has placed on your life. Fight against humanity, the worst impulses of us. And that's what Jesus did in John 18. What's true? Something about that kind of life draws people. It's up to them to make the decision, though. We'll talk more in the next couple weeks. Listen, thanks for being here. Love you. We'll be back here Same time next week. Coming close to ending John.